Welcome to Forgotten Architectural History. In 2006, when an Oslo newspaper asked its readers to select the city's ugliest building, they picked this one, the Index House, by a wide margin. This was due at least in part because this 1960s brutalist structure replaced the English Quarter, a late 19th century building complex. As another newspaper commented after the vote, the beautiful English Quarter was demolished and replaced with this hideous building. Since its destruction, the English Quarter has symbolized what many considered misplaced civic values, and it became a rallying cry and turning point for subsequent historic preservation efforts in Oslo, which in many cases succeeded. It remains a touchstone. In June 2022, a member of the group Architectural Rebellion Norway asserted, "The future is going to hate our choices in the same way, for example, that we hate that the generation before us demolished the English Quarter to build the Index House." The birth, life, death, and afterlife of the English Quarter is an Oslo story, but there are parallels around the world. In New York City, where I live, we had the original Penn Station, which was destroyed around the same time. That was the catalyst for New York City's landmark law, which has preserved thousands of historic buildings. As for the English Quarter, it was located in what is now the west end of central Oslo, but in the mid-1800s the area was occupied by private estates. However, as the city population grew, this area's properties were subdivided into smaller plots. In 1868, a young architect named Paul Due bought a property along Drammen Road, Drammensveien in Norwegian. Let me pause to note that I'm mostly using English equivalent names here, though there are some instances where I also mention the original Norwegian ones. I don't speak the language and apologize for any pronunciation mistakes. Please share any corrections in the comments. Getting back to Paul Due, there was an old manor house on the property he bought. This image, published in 1893, shows what the West End looked like in the early 1880s, and I believe, though I'm not certain, that the large house in the foreground is the one Due purchased and later demolished to construct the English Quarter. As architect, owner, and developer, Due believed that there was a demand for housing among the upper middle class that could be addressed by combining the luxury of a private villa with modern conveniences and proximity to the growing city of Christiania, as Oslo was then called. On his property, which was over 100 meters long but only about 20 meters wide, that's over 300 feet by 60 feet, he designed 9 buildings, began construction in the mid-1880s, and completed them in phases from 1887 to 1890. This map shows their location with their addresses. They faced onto Drammen Road, a public square, and an adjoining park. This rendering from 1886 shows the development. I've added the house numbers for identification purposes. On the ends, there were apartment buildings with 1 unit on each floor at numbers 26 and 42. In between them is a row of 7 townhouses, each intended to be a single residence, numbered 28 through 40. They were French Renaissance style with domes, towers, pilasters, pediments, balconies, and balustrades. The facades were a mix of brick and stone, and, according to some sources, render. There were front gardens lined with iron railings. Due took a bit of creative license and called the townhouses villas, and in fact, initially he named the complex the English Villa Quarter, or Engelska Villa Kvarter in Norwegian. But why English? Although French in style, the townhouse configuration was typical of row houses in London and other cities in England. This was a building form not common in Scandinavia, so the name was an exercise in branding and the design an effort to create a new market niche. Aesthetically, it was well received. One newspaper called it a very beautiful complex, while another described it as Architect Due's magnificent English house complex in red and white at Drammen Road, 7 buildings next to each other and architecturally closely linked. Due studied in Hanover, Germany, and his business partner, Bernhard Steckmest, who some architectural historians believe deserves credit for the design, was a German native. But here, they created what several people over the years praised as a French smile on Oslo's urban landscape. There was a 10th building added in 1900, built as an eastern extension of number 26, with the address 26B. The English Quarter was hard to capture fully in photographs, but this model, executed in its last days to preserve its memory, shows the complex as it appeared in the early 1900s. Again, I've added the house numbers. Notice the varied, symmetrical facade and roofline patterns of the 7 townhouses and how the apartment buildings form visual anchors at each end. Number 26B was different in one important respect compared to the others. From the start, it included ground floor commercial space, which was a harbinger of things to come. Here's a photo of it from the early 1900s, with close-ups of some of the facade details. Like many architectural landmarks, the English Quarter served as a muse for artists. However, as a business venture, it did not live up to expectations. Dua, who had an apartment in number 26 and long maintained an office there, tried to sell all the buildings, but he found few takers. Here's an early ad for two of the so-called villas from 1887. Here's another ad showing he was still selling 5 of the 9 original properties in 1890. It was only in 1916 that he sold the Western apartment building, number 42. And it appears he still owned number 26, where he resided at the time of his death in 1919, over 50 years after he purchased this land. Perhaps a reason for this is that the area became a busy crossroads, with lots of tram and car traffic, making it less attractive as a home for rich families. On the other hand, this made it a good place for commercial activities. As an example, the center townhouse at number 34, which was the grandest of all, was purchased by an artist and art dealer in 1921 who converted it into an art gallery. The next year, he rented it to the Russian trade delegation. Similar changes occurred in the other buildings over the first half of the 20th century, so that gradually there was a complete shift from housing to other uses. In February 1958, several business groups and their architect announced plans to tear down what they described as the old, obsolete structures and replace them with a new, efficient, and modern office complex. This new development would house various companies and business associations, including the Norwegian Industrial Association and the Norwegian Export Council. Index House is a streamlining of what would become the building's official name, Industry and Exports House. Although final project approval by the city government was not granted until June 1961, the 3-year process was due mainly to a series of revisions to the development proposal, not because of objections to the demolition. Most of the elected officials who decided the English Quarter's fate accepted and endorsed the arguments that the buildings were not of sufficient value to be saved. At the time, Norwegian buildings from the late 19th century were not protected by cultural heritage laws. In fact, there had been previous proposals to take down the English Quarter. In 1929, the city considered a plan for a major new road that would cut across the English Quarter, requiring its expropriation. In 1940, the city issued a plan that envisioned replacing it with a functionalist office block. In 1941, the 3 buildings at the western end of the site were purchased by Norsk Hydro, a company which intended to replace them with a new headquarters. The image here shows a rendering with the existing buildings outlined as a sort of ghost. Although these proposals were unrealized, Norsk Hydro retained its 3 properties and had offices there. In the mid-1950s, Norsk Hydro decided to build a new building at a nearby site, which opened in 1960. The company cooperated with a group that wanted to replace the English Quarter with another modernist skyscraper. Some proponents of the Index House project saw the English Quarter's demolition as providing an added benefit, namely removing an example of bad architecture. The project's architect, John Eng, told a newspaper he couldn't, with his best will, find any architectural qualities in this quarter. Others suggested that while the English Quarter may have once had value, its time had passed both functionally and aesthetically. Unlike today, where adaptive reuse of old buildings is viewed positively, in an age when functionalism was seen as a core value, its conversion to other uses was cited as evidence of its obsolescence. Also, much was made of alterations to the building exterior that, so the argument went, ruined its historic integrity. As such, it was not worth saving. Even some historic preservationists shared this view. In fact, there had been complaints since the 1930s about changes to the buildings. In particular, the alteration of the ground floor facade of number 32 had been criticized. In an environment like the English Quarter, a 1934 newspaper article opined, an extra requirement is set for the architect, because one has the right to demand from him that in his facade design he takes into account the whole. Also, the loss of the front gardens, which were gone by the mid-40s, added insult to injury. Now it looks horrible, a 1946 magazine article complained. It looks as hideous as possible, to the colossal annoyance of the city's population. But I think those critics wanted the building restored, not abandoned entirely. Getting back to the Index House proposal, there were people arguing for keeping the English Quarter, including several building heritage officials. Although they received press coverage, they had no legal means to stop the demolition. Historian Lars Emil Hansen, who wrote a detailed magazine article about the English Quarter in 2008, and which has been an important source for this video, explains that the efforts to save it were going against the establishment views of the time. Among architects like John Eng, functionalism was the dominant paradigm, and with it went a disdain for historicist architectural styles. As for politicians, and especially those on the left, most had little sympathy for preserving what they viewed as an ostentatious and elitist relic of an era that should not be celebrated. Only a few conservative city council members voted against the project. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in this same period, those trying to save Penn Station were stymied by another problem. As Elliot Walensky, one of the campaigners there, later said, "I would say there was no consciousness among most New Yorkers of the value of old architecture." This also seems to have been true in Oslo. Prominent among those trying to save the English Quarter was Dr. Stefan Tschudi-Madsen, a conservation official for the national government. He argued that the English Quarter was highly significant and should be saved and restored. He was joined by some other historic conservation leaders and received some sympathetic press coverage, but it did not persuade the politicians. Nevertheless, he sensed a shift in the zeitgeist. In early 1961, he told a newspaper, "I see this whole opposition as a very gratifying sign, and even though we are now losing the English Quarter, I think we have a good position for the next round." Demolition of the English Quarter began in January 1962 and was carried out in stages until the last building to go, number 26B, the last built, was torn down in early 1966. During that 4-year demolition period, as remnants of the English Quarter remained while the phased construction of the Index House advanced, there was a juxtaposition of old and new, side by side. In 1964, a newspaper published a photo illustrating this and observed, "You get to decide for yourself which architectural era you like best." It turned out that Tschudi-Madsen was prophetic. A lot of people liked old buildings, perhaps more than they themselves had previously realized. As a result, support for historic preservation among the general population grew. When he gave that newspaper interview in 1961, he named 2 historic areas then under threat that he believed would be saved in the wake of losing the English Quarter. One was a villa district called Homensbayen that would have been decimated by a proposed roadway project. But in the mid-60s, efforts to protect this area largely succeeded, and most buildings were saved, including some designed by Due and Steckmest, such as the ones shown here that share some similarities with the English Quarter. The other building he thought would be safe from destruction is Victoria Terrassa, another large 1880s apartment complex designed by 4 architects, including, once again, Due and Steckmest. Now used as government offices, it was modified in the 60s, but still stands today. Let's return where we started, to that 2006 vote on Oslo's ugliest building. Although Index House was chosen as the ugliest, it has its fans. There have been a number of people over the years calling for its demolition and for the English Quarter to be rebuilt, but that's extremely unlikely. Index House is now a listed building, ironically a process it helped to facilitate. Finally, in 2006, there was also a vote to name Oslo's prettiest building. First place went to the Akerhus Castle, but second place went to Victoria Terrassa. Beauty, of course, is in the eye of the beholder, but many people consider the English Quarter to have been superior to Victoria Terrassa. We can only wonder, if the English Quarter was still with us, how would it have fared in the prettiest building vote? Thanks for watching. For more information, please see the description below. If you enjoyed this, please like, comment, and subscribe.